Hi, Dave Scotland for cgswot.com, and welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at an aged film effect, but we're going to do it in a fairly unique way in that we're going to utilize particles to generate a lot of the anomalies that you see on the film. So this is the effect that we're shooting for, and you'll see that there's a lot of dirt and noise and scratches happening all over the screen, plus there's these streaks, these lines. And basically they're all generated using particle systems in After Effects. So basically we're going to start with this footage here, which is just some simple footage I shot with the DSLR just in a rainforest near where I live. And not a lot of production value went into it, but that's quite deliberate. I wanted it to feel like an old piece of footage, which usually didn't have a lot of production value in that old sort of vintage footage. So very simple pan across a bit of a scene, and we take that and we turn it into this here, which I think is quite believable. There's certainly a few more things that we could do to it, but we're gonna shoot for this effect here. Another thing to be aware of that we've put in there is this slight flicker to the film around the edge using the vignette, and we're going to incorporate that as well, plus some color correction and some tinting as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm in a new project in After Effects, and the only thing I've brought into the project is the waterfall background movie that I've just shown you, and I've also done this dirt maps JPEG, and if I show you what that looks like, basically I've just used various brushes in After Effects, and I've got 4 across the top and 4 down, and we're going to use those as some of the dirt elements to go in over the top of our footage, and we're going to utilize these as particles in our particle system. So that'll become a little bit more apparent as we move forward. So we can go ahead and get started. Let's grab our waterfall movie and drag it down onto our project, our composition button, and that's going to create a new composition, and it's going to inherit the settings for the footage, which are 720 by 406, which is sort of a shrunk down resolution of a high def 1080 resolution. So it's the same sort of dimensions, but just shrunk down to something that's a little bit more workable for the tutorial. We'll just switch that now to fit to comp. And what we're going to do first of all is get our length right. Now, aged footage, the old vintage footage used to be shot with a camera that had a hand crank mechanism on the side, and what people used to do is crank that mechanism a little bit too fast, and a little bit too slow. And what that would mean is that when it was played back later on a projector, things in the shot would tend to be sped up, and you might have seen that in some old vintage footage, that when people walk around or something happens in the scene, it always seems to be sped up and a little bit too fast. So we want to mimic that. So what we're going to do is take our footage here, we're going to bring up our time settings down the bottom here, just using this switch at the bottom, and we're going to stretch it to 50%. And go OK. Now what that does, if I just get rid of those time settings now, and I might just get rid of parent, we don't need that, it shortens our footage by half, but it speeds up the footage. If I play that back now, you'll see that the footage itself is sped up and the movements are all sped up, and that's exactly what we want. So we can go ahead and grab our work area and bring it to the end of the footage, right click on the work area brackets there, and just go trim comp to work area, and that just makes our comp match our footage in length. And we might as well get some color treatment out of the road, and that will just help as we start to put elements over the top. We're going to be seeing those elements on top of the treated footage rather than the standard footage. And that just makes life a lot easier when you want to see how it's reading. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go layer, new, adjustment layer, and we're just going to hit enter to rename that, and we'll just call this noise. We're just going to put a little bit of film noise onto this element. So I'm just going to right click on my effects panel here, and we'll bring up noise, and we're just going to use noise. Now there are some other options, but this one is fairly light on processing, so feel free to use those other options. What we're going to do is we'll crank this up. Let's go to about 10% on the noise, but then just get rid of use color noise, and that's going to give us, you can see that we've got a lot of noise grain there. You can see it sort of dancing around in the shot, and that's exactly what we want. We want the noise to change on every frame, and that's working nicely. So that noise is going to work nicely. We'll go for a new adjustment layer, and once again we'll hit enter, and we'll call this color correct, and we'll just highlight that and then right click in the effects. The first thing we're going to put in is a color correction tint, and we're just going to leave it at 100%. We basically want to take all the color out by tinting it just black and white, and then we're going to use a color correction tritone. Now what we're going to do with that, what that does is gives us a nice sepia effect there. We're going to amend it a little bit. Just use the eyedropper on the shadows here and click on the midtones, and then click on the swatch for the shadows, and just drag it down in that same color spectrum. Just drag it down a little bit and go OK. Do the same for the highlights. Click on the midtone swatch to make them match, and then click on the color swatch for highlights, and just drag it up and maybe drag it out of the color a little bit, introduce a little bit of white. Something like that is going to be fine. Now we're just going to wind in or blend with the original a little bit, or quite a lot actually. Let's bring it up to around about 60%. Blend with original. So we want almost black and white. We can go a little bit higher. Let's go 70%. So if I switch that on and off, you'll see that it's a very subtle color change to it. And we can just close these up. And the next one we're going to put in there is a brightness and contrast from our color correction. Just go brightness and contrast, and we're just going to wind the brightness down. Just wind it down to about, let's go to about 30, and then wind the contrast out of it. Probably sit at about 40. Let's make it 41. Whoop, minus 41. And what you see there is it's really taken the contrast out, and we've dropped the brightness down just to compensate. If that brightness was up at 0, it would really be too blown out. So let's bring that down. 32 should be fine, and they're pretty good settings for what we're looking for. Now what we want to do is sort of globally bring a little bit of the contrast back in. So we're just going to use some color correction curves, and we'll just bring up the brightness a little bit, and then just introduce a little bit of a contrast curve there. And that's, you'll see with and without, it's just a nice lift to the image, and that's going to work quite nicely. And what we could do also is just grab our waterfall and just go blur, sharpen, fast blur. What we're going to do is just add a little bit of blur. You know, that most of the old vintage footage just had that little bit of blurred element to it. Let's go, just 1 is fine, and it's just given us a nice little sort of blur to the shot. And already we have something that's just a little bit more believable as a vintage shot. So we'll go ahead now and create some particles. So the first one we want to do are the streaks, which are caused by fine bits of dirt on the film stock, and then as the film stock is dragged through the projector mechanism, those little pieces of dirt are actually scratched along the film, and that's how you get those streaks that are happening in the film. It's particles of dirt that are sort of scratched as the film moves through the projector. So let's go ahead and create a new solid, and we'll call this solid, let's call it scratch. And what we're going to do with this is actually make it a width of 2 pixels wide, but leave the height, or actually we'll make the height a little bit more. Let's go 500 on the height, and let's make the color white. and we'll go OK to that. And we're left with this sort of streak down the middle. Let's grab that layer. Let's actually move it to the bottom, and we'll just isolate it. We're going to grab that layer and just go Layer, Pre-Compose, and we'll leave it as Scratch. We'll call it Scratch Particle. And leave all attributes and open new composition. So we'll go OK. So what we've got is a new composition that's the same width, and that's exactly what we need. Now what we're going to do is mask that out with a bit of noise. So let's go ahead and create a new solid. Let's make this one black so that it's a bit easier to see, and we'll just call this let's call it noise mask. It's the same 4 pixels. Oh, it's inherited 4 pixels because a composition in After Effects can't be any smaller than 4 pixels wide. And we'll go OK to that. So there's our noise, or our solid for our noise. We need to add the noise. So with it selected, we'll right click and just go noise and grain and fractal noise. And you'll see there that we get this sort of broken pattern. We need to bring a bit of the contrast out in that, so just crank up the contrast a bit. Just it makes the edges a little bit harder on the noise, and it's pretty close to what we want. I think we could probably bring the brightness up a little bit more, something like that. And let's play with the evolution down here. Just click on the stopwatch, and before we go any further, actually, what that's done is created a keyframe for hit U. It's created a keyframe for the noise evolution. But let's go into our comp settings, and let's change the amount of frames to 10, and this is for our Scratch Particle comp. And so now we only have the 10 frames. Let's move that keyframe back to 0. It should have been at 0, and then we'll come through to our last keyframe, and let's make it 2 full evolutions. And what you get is this noise that dances around on the screen there. So now that we've got our noise, we can use that noise as a mask for our scratch using our track mats. So we'll use a Luma mat, and now if we use that Luma mat and just bring up our transparency, you'll see that we have transparency built in, and there is our noise sort of moving around. And that's going to, the reason why we've done that is going to become more apparent as we use that particle. So let's come back to our main movie. Let's rename that actually. It's taken the name of the footage that we dragged down to create the comp. Let's just highlight it up here in our project window, hit enter, and we'll call it Master Comp. And that's okay. And we've got our noise there in the shot, and you'll notice it's very short compared to the rest of our footage, but that's fine. And what we're going to do is toggle our switches and make it a 3D layer, because we're going to be using that as a particle in Particular. And when you use layers as particles, they have to be 3D layers. So we can actually switch the visibility for that off as well. So let's go ahead and create a new solid, and we'll call this, let's call it Scratch Particles. And make it comp size. We'll make it white because it's a white effect that we're going for. You've got to remember that any scratches on film show up as white because the light projects through the scratch, and the scratch is a gap in the film, and so the light comes through it. Let's highlight that layer. We'll go into our effects controls and right click Trapcode Particular. Now I'll show you how to set this one up, but the other ones, just to keep time short, I'm going to use some presets that I set up before time, and all of these presets will be in the download file for the project. So I'll include the presets in there. So we've got our scratch particles. I'm just going to isolate it, and you'll see if I come through time a bit, we have our particles in the center there. Let's go to our emitter first, and we'll bring our particles back to, let's say 20 is fine, 20 per second. And the first thing we need to do is get rid of all of the velocity of the particles. We don't need any velocity to happen in the particles. And we're going to change the emitter type to box. And you'll see that that's a box in the center there. We want the box size to be the width of our comp, and in this instance it's 720, and that'll push those particles right out to the side. And we want the emitter in the Y to be 0 and Z to be 0, and that leaves a line through the center here, and that'll become more apparent when we change the particle type here. So let's go ahead and go into particles now, and let's change the life. We want the life to be 0.1, really quite low, and that means that the particles pop on and pop off quite quickly. And we'll just give ourselves a bit more room so we can see what we're doing here. Squeeze that over a bit. So you'll see that the particles are popping on and popping off quite quickly. So now what we need to do is just change the particle type. So we're going to use a sprite, and then that opens up our texture option here, and we go into texture and we switch our texture down to scratch particle, and then we need to change our time sampling. At the moment it's current time, and that's why we're not seeing anything. You will see them down here early on because they're part of because the current time is covered, but once it gets beyond where it's cut off, there is no particles. So we need to switch our current time to random still frame. And what that means is that the particles will be created throughout the whole animation or effect, and they'll be randomly selected from our scratch particles timeline. It'll select a particle here and then one there and then so forth. So that's exactly what we want. Now it's looking a little bit thick there, and so what we can do is go back and just make sure that our pre-comp scratch particle, our solid, we can go layer, solid settings, it's at 2. Let's drop that down to 1 on that one, and let's go with the noise mask, which is a solid as well, and just make sure that it's at 1 as well, and go OK. Now when we come back into our master comp, they're a lot thinner, and that's exactly what we want. We want them to be nice and thin, and that's going to work nicely for what we're looking for. Try to maintain the adjustment layers. Try to keep them on top of the stack as we build, because it just helps having those adjustment layers above these effects that we're putting in there, because it's going to give us that sort of global tint and sepia values that we want over the top of our film. But you'll see there that our particles are working nicely. Now let's toggle our switches and make that scratch particles a screen layer, and that's just going to help them show up. You could go add and see what they look like, but you don't want them too dominant, so let's just go screen for now. I think that's going to work a lot nicer, and we can move on to our next particle setting. Everything seems to be working nicely there. So let's go layer, new, solid. This time we're going to go let's go 30 by 30 in the size. We're going to call this, let's call it dust, and we'll make the color white and go OK. Now you'll see that it's created a small solid in the center here. Let's go ahead and move that down below our scratch particles, and with it highlighted we're going to go layer, pre-compose, and we'll just call it, let's call this dust particle, and leave all attributes and open new comp. We'll go OK. So there's our new comp, and it's actually quite small, but it's going to suit our needs. And what we're going to do is create a mask, just a 3-point mask. So just click, click, and click, and that's fine. And with that selected, we're going to right click on our effects. We're going to go generate stroke, and just down the bottom where it says paint style, just go on transparent. And then what that means is that our mask is the only thing that shows up, and that's exactly what we want. So let's come back to our frame 0 and we'll go comp settings, and we just need to also change this down. Let's go to 10 variations on this little scratch will do. So go OK to that. So what we have here are 10 frames, and each frame we need to change this mask. So bring up our mask settings, and then in the mask path, click the stopwatch to create a keyframe. Then when we go to mask to the next frame, just grab some points on the mask here, and drag it out and just make some variation on our mask, and keep doing this until you have some nice variations all the way through that animation. Drag this down. Make sure you stay inside the area, and you'll see here that we're getting these variations of that scratch or dirt pattern or dust. Whoa, just undo that. Going to slide this in a little bit, drag it down. Won't matter that it's sort of crossed over like that. These are little scratches that have happened on the film. We might swing some back the other way now. We'll bring this over here. Go to that next one. Bring this one out. And so we're just getting some variations on that dirt. And there's our variations there. Now we'll make a couple of amendments here. Let's switch the brush size down to 1. We'll make it 1.5. We'll go brush hardness, really crank the brush hardness up to 100. Everything else should be fine for our masks there. And now we can come back to our master comp and make sure, toggle our switches and make sure it's a 3D layer. I'm just going to switch off everything here, and we're going to create a new solid, and we're going to call this dust particles. We'll make it comp size, so click on the make comp size there, and we'll leave that white as well. And we'll introduce our Trapcode Particular, and I've got a preset that, as I mentioned before, I'll include this in the download file. We've got the preset of film dust, and now when we scrub through, when you use a preset that uses a layer as a particle, you have to make sure that in the particle settings that layer is set up, and you'll see here that it's set up as a sprite, but there's nothing in the layer setting here, and we need to make sure that dust particle is set up there, and now you'll see we have dust happening. Now it looks fairly extreme. There's a couple of things we need to do here. Let's just close up Particular and add another effect of matte simple choke, and just choke that effect in a little bit just to make those particles a little tighter. Let's make it 1.6. That's going to work nicely there. You'll see that we've got some nice variations of size. It's using the random values of the dust particles that we set up here, and it's sort of creating them all over the screen. Now it looks like there's a few too many, but by the time you bring all of the elements back in, and if I do a RAM preview here, you'll see that it's not as noticeable because we're not on black, and it's really working quite well. There are a couple of other things that we're going to do to it, but let's just have a look at that. It's working quite nicely, and I think it's going to work for what we need. Now let's toggle our switches and make sure that our dust particles are down underneath our color correction and noise, and also make sure that it's a screen layer mode. and that's going to work nicely for those. I think we could also, I'll just bring it to a point where we can see some scratches here. There's one there. Let's add a little bit of blur sharpen, a little bit of fast blur, and let's go 1.5 on the fast blur, and it's just going to give us a nice, not so harsh effect as that noise pops all over the screen, and that's going to work nicely. So let's go ahead and use some dirt now. Now the dirt is a negative element in that it doesn't have light shining through like a scratch does. It's actually dirt or oil or grease or some sort of foreign element that has been stuck to the footage, and that means light can't penetrate it and can't go through it, and therefore it's a dark effect. So let's go ahead and grab our dirt maps, and we're going to bring that down underneath our dust particles, and we're going to layer pre-compose, and we'll just call it dirt particle, and open a new comp, leave all attributes and go OK. Now it's inherited the size, and so a couple of changes we need to make here. First, in our composition settings, we need to make our comp 60 by 60, because I've made the actual dirt map 240 by 240, and if you divide that by 4, it's 60. So this little area here is 60, 60, and so on. So 60 by 60, and the length is 16, because we've got 16 different bits of dirt here. So let's go OK to that, and it makes this smaller comp. And just with that layer selected, hit P to bring up position, and hit a keyframe at frame 0 here. So we'll come in and we'll reposition our layer like so on that first color there. Now when we go to the next keyframe, we reposition on the second one. Next keyframe, reposition, so you start to get the idea of where we're heading here, like so. And when you get to this one, go to the next keyframe and just move it up, like so, and then back across to the left. And then when we get to this one here, we'll go to a new keyframe and just move it up again. And so we keep using this technique until we have a separate pattern or a separate dirt element for each frame. And just like our last particle system that we put in, we're going to utilize a different particle by using the random still frame value in particular. So that's it. Now we have our different smudges and dirt and elements on the screen. So we can come back to our master comp now, switch off the visibility, we don't need it visible, and make sure it's a 3D element. So we're going to create a new solid, and this time we'll make it black just so that visually in our comp we'll know that it's a sort of a negative element, and we'll call this one dirt particles, and make sure that it's comp size and go OK. And we'll drag it down on top of our dust particles, and let's bring in our Trapcode Particular, and we're going to load our preset, which is our film dirt. Now once again we need to come into the particle setting and make sure that we have the dirt particle selected, and you'll see now that if I just isolate that and switch off the transparency, you'll see that we get a bit of a problem. Or I can switch that transparency back on. We've got squares happening everywhere, and that's not what we want. So let's go back to our dirt particle and let's get rid of that white background. So let's go layer, new, solid, make it black, and let's call this let's call it dirt base. That's going to be fine. Just trying to keep things neat with the naming. 60 by 60 is fine, and go OK. Let's move it down underneath our dirt maps, and then use the dirt maps as a an inverted luma matte. And if I switch the transparency off, you'll now see that we have just the noise, just the dirt, and not the white background. So if we come back to our master comp now and just switch that transparency, you'll see that we're getting our noise happening all over the screen, and it's working quite nicely. I'll just give you a RAM preview of what that looks like. So we're getting this noise flickering all over the screen. So let's come to a point where we have some good noise elements on the screen. That'll do there. And switch on the other elements. Now if I come in, you'll see that it's this big black noise there, and we don't really want it that harsh. So let's go with an overlay and see if that makes a little bit of difference with our noise. I think an overlay is going to work nicely for now. And let's give it a RAM preview and see how. Let's give it a RAM preview and see how that's coming up. Okay, that's looking pretty good now. I'll play that through at normal speeds, just 150 frame RAM preview there. But it's working quite nicely, and it looks like we've got things sort of happening the way we want with our particles. So we can move on now to the vignette process, but just before we do, just in the dirt particles, let's go ahead and introduce a little bit of blur. We'll go fast blur, and let's give it about a 2 on the fast blur, repeat on edges, and that's just going to help the effect sort of merge into the scene a little bit more. Let's create a new solid. We'll call this one vignette anim. Make it comp size, make it black, and go OK. And just with our elliptic mask tool, just double click on that to create an ellipse mask, and that in the mask settings, just invert it and then feather the mask, really quite harsh feather. That's something like that, around about 80 was nice, and just expand the mask out a little bit. Make it an even. Let's make it 15 on the mask expansion. So what we can do with that is animate the expansion of that mask. So we're just going to click on the animation on the stopwatch, come through. We're just going to zoom in on our timeline a little bit. We're going to come through to about 4 frames and create our mask expansion. We're going to pop it out a little bit more, so make it 30. Let's maybe 25, and you'll see there that it moves out like so. Now what we can do, that we've got that animated, is just set up a little bit of a script to get it to loop. Now if you alt click on the stopwatch, that allows us to put in some code here. Now you could type it in, but the code we're looking for can be found if you click on this little arrow. It'll bring up this menu for all the different sorts of predetermined script, and the one we want down here is in property, and we want loop out. And if you just click on loop out, you'll see now, I'll just isolate that and do a RAM preview. It's going to continue flickering at that same rate that we made with the keyframes throughout the whole animation. And it's just a nice easy way to loop something that you've already animated the 2 points. So that's going to work nicely for our vignette, animated vignette, but we need another vignette. So we go layer, new, solid, and we'll just call this vignette. It's not going to have any animation on it. Make it comp size and black, and this time we're going to put a rectangle mask on it. And just in the mask settings, if I isolate this and invert the mask, and if I isolate, you'll see that there's nothing visible because we've masked out the center. But if we create a bit of feather on it, it brings it in slightly, and then just bring the mask expansion in ever so slightly, like that is fine. That's going to give us a sort of a constant vignette. When you incorporate the other vignette, that's the effect that we get there. So let's unhide everything else. Let's take our vignette, animated vignette, hit T, and let's just bring the opacity down on that. Bring it down to 60. And the other vignette, hit T, and we'll bring that down to about 80. So let's go ahead and do a RAM preview of our final effect here. I'll just hide all those masks. So we're going to do a RAM preview, and then once it's rendered, we'll come back and show you what it looks like. So there's our final effect there, and I think it's working quite nicely. There's always things that you can tweak to make it a little bit more believable, but we've got our bases covered. We've got a bit of noise happening, some scratches, and then we've got our sort of linear elongated scratches down the film as well. And we've got the flicker, that old film flicker to it as well. And I think the sepia and the tinted tone is working nicely as well. But as I said, you know, it's do it to your own taste, but use these effects. I think they work quite well. There are some other tutorials on the web that do us that show you how to sort of mimic this effect, but they're usually overlays, and you have to be careful with an overlay, because an overlay is either going to be using the light values or the dark values, but you'll find, as I said before, certain elements on the effect are light projecting from the projector through scratches, which are light, but then you've also got dark smudges and things like that, which are dark, and an overlay is never going to, you need to separate those elements in order to achieve that if you want to use it as an overlay. Or if you want to use the overlay method. Using these particles, you've got a lot more control on the degree of degradation of the film and the vintage of it, and I think it's something that you really should have a try and keep in your little black book of tricks. So that's the effect, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Until next time, bye for now.